Okay, my friends, it is a day. Actually, like last night was a day in and of itself. And we have so much we have to talk about today. Welcome to Resistance Live. It's ECM. It is the 3rd of October, 2024. And we have our very own October surprise, what I suspect will be the first of many to discuss today. Namely, Jack Smith's filing yesterday in the DC District Court being publicly released. I will remind you all that this was filed last week, and I predicted at the time that it was going to be completely full of bombshell new evidence, and I wasn't wrong. So we're going to talk about all of that. We're going to talk about the potential impact on the election. We're going to talk about potential co-conspirators. We're going to talk about what it means for the jury pool. All sorts of details to talk about today, and I'm really glad you're all here. Okay, first things first. Today, for our visually challenged viewers, I'm wearing a black turtleneck sweater. My hair is pulled back tight today. I am a pig-skinned, green-eyed, dirty, blonde-haired woman, and I'm in my office in front of an oak cabinet and a stack of books and my plant. I'm coming to you, as always, from occupied Muncie, Lenape, and Mohican land. Gratitude to the original custodians of the land on which I live and work. Okay, so late yesterday, Judge Chutkin ordered that the brief that Jack Smith had filed in support of his claim that the new superseding indictment and the evidence that he will present at trial falls outside the scope of the Supreme Court's immunity decision was released publicly on the docket with very minor redactions. I'm just going to remind you all there's also an appendix still looming for this, for which Trump's legal team has a week from today to submit proposed objections to the redactions there. Shockingly, the redactions in this brief were very small compared to what we were expecting. Honestly, the only thing that is redacted from this brief are the names of co-conspirators and witnesses. There's really not much else that is subject to redaction in this. So we got a very robust 165-page brief with extremely limited redactions that dropped an enormous amount of new evidence, frankly, on the general public with regard to Trump's criminal conduct in the weeks leading up to January 6th and on January 6th itself. I have to say that, as you all know, I have been deeply steeped in the available evidence on January 6th for an extremely long time. Those of you who have been with me, not just all the way back to January 6th of 2021, but before that, know that I have historically done very thorough read-throughs and breakdowns of key legal documents since Trump took office, essentially. And I am very familiar with what the January 6th committee did, with the pleadings that have been filed in other related prosecutions, with the evidence that has been filed thus far in this matter. And I will tell you that I was rendered pretty much speechless by what is contained in this 165-page brief. About 90 or so pages of it is just discussion to and citations of evidence that have been gathered by the FBI and the DOJ in furtherance of the prosecution of Donald Trump, much of which we have never seen before. It includes things like text messages, like evidence such as Pence's handwritten notes from meetings with the President Donald Trump at the time. It includes things like comments that Donald Trump made related to January 6th and on January 6th itself. It includes witness interviews from witnesses that I don't think we're going to be able to identify on the basis of information that's currently available, because it's very clearly witness testimony that we have never seen before. It's truly a shocking set of revelations in this brief. So I want to go through the kind of top level stuff on this. And I did a breakdown of this on Threads last night in a post that has now been shared like 10,000 times, that goes through with screenshots the most surprising elements of the evidence here. But let me just take you all through the highest level takeaways from this brief. All right. And I'm going to remind you all, it's 165 pages. It's publicly available. You can read it yourself if you want to. All right. But just for the sake of giving you guys, the too long don't read takeaways, the brief goes through the beginning of the conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. election before the election even was called, all the way through the events of January 6th itself. Okay. And one of the things that's very apparent here, which is really relevant for where we find ourselves right now, a month and a couple of days from the 2024 election, is that the plot to overturn the election results began before the 2020 election itself and was signaled in private donor events for Trump's donors. And essentially the messaging coming out of those events was, it doesn't matter what the results are. We're just going to declare victory and act accordingly. And if the results don't line up with that, too bad. We don't care about the details. We're going to make it happen no matter what. So the thing to keep in mind about this is that it's very, very clear that Trump knew that he was going to lose in advance of the 2020 election based on everything that he had been told and everything that their internal polling was showing, and that he knew within very close proximity to the November 2020 election itself that he had lost. He was told more times than I could honestly count based on the evidence in this brief that they had legitimately lost the election and there was no evidence of fraud in the 7 states that they were targeting to try to overturn the election results. He was told this so many times that honestly, there can be no doubt that he knew that the election had been lost and that the claims that he and his people were making publicly on Twitter to state election officials and beyond were flat out lies. Okay, so, again, this is really important because it relates to his mental state or his intent in participating in the conspiracy to overthrow the election. There is no legitimacy in the context of any legal defense that he may try to mount that they thought that there were true problems with the way in which the 2020 election had been conducted. He was told by state election officials, by people at the RNC, by his own advisors, by outside advisors, that there was no evidence of any widespread fraud of any kind in the 7 states where they worked nonstop for 2 months to overthrow the election results. So, oh, bye. Yay, troll bell. See you later. So to keep all of this in context, one of the things that's really relevant to this is the evidence of meetings that is contained in the brief, okay? And there were dozens upon dozens of meetings with state officials, with people advising Donald Trump, with Mike Pence himself, where it was acknowledged that there was no legitimacy to the claims that the 2020 election had been stolen, all right? And in reviewing this, one of the things that I will just tell you was my big takeaway in reviewing the brief itself. And I've had other moments like this in the context of January 6th, but I want to make it really clear here that, you can't read this without seeing in horror, truly, the vast breadth of what this conspiracy tried to do. It was nationwide. It involved dozens of people. It involved, I think, easily hundreds of phone conversations, text messages, communications, incidents of harassment, beratement, insults to try to get elected officials to violate their oaths of office. And the sheer scope of it is shocking, like in and of itself. The totality with which the people who were working with Trump and Trump himself went in on this is mind-blowing. I mean, honestly, quite legitimately mind-blowing. One of the things that happened in the earliest days after the election that's reflected in this brief is that Trump was told by his immediate advisors and legal advisors in particular that there was no merit to trying to challenge the 2020 election. And so what did he do? He fired those people or sidelined them and put Giuliani in charge of the entire effort instead. And that then led to him being able to shut out people who were otherwise responsible for guardrailing what he was going to do, okay? And as it became clear that state election officials from Georgia to Michigan to Arizona were not going to play ball with all of his pressure campaign, they then turned all of their efforts to overturn the 2020 election to Mike Pence. And I have to say that the section in the brief that contains so much new evidence about the pressure that was levied on Pence made me legitimately nauseous. It was as if Pence was in the line of fire for weeks, multiple times a day, being pressured by Trump, by people like Steve Bannon, by various other officials in the conspiracy to completely disregard his oath of office and overthrow American democracy. Now, I said this morning on Threads that I have to say this is a caveat. I am so far from being a fan of Mike Pence, it's kind of hard to fathom, right? Like, dude was responsible for an HIV outbreak in Indiana and endorsed things like conversion therapy. So please don't mistake anything that I am about to say as in any way an endorsement of Mike Pence, the politician, all right? But it is impossible, and it is impossible to read this section of the brief and not have like an immediate taste in your mouth of what the experience must have been like for Mike Pence trying to withstand what he was put under in the days leading up to January 6th. It's very clear that he tried all these strategies that those of us who are abuse survivors will recognize to try to like ameliorate and calm down Donald Trump. He said to him at certain points, this is just an intermission. You can run again in 2024. He said to him in words that are described as like gentle, right? We just have to let this go. It's clear that there's not really any basis for this and it's time to move on. He adopted, and you can see this over the course of like dozens of conversations, pretty much every strategy imaginable except like screaming at Donald Trump, who he, is reported to have been, the most loyal person inside that White House, to try to get Trump to stop. And in the days and hours leading up to January 6th itself, Trump became ever more abusive of Mike Pence, saying things like hundreds of thousands of people are going to hate you. People will think that you are stupid. You are just too honest. And these are like word for word quotes that are contained in the brief itself. And then, of course, there's the fact that on January 6th itself, Donald Trump was advised that Mike Pence had been moved to a secure location. And this truly, one of the interesting things about this from a legal standpoint, just as a quick interlude here, is that the evidence that I'm about to talk about is something that Jack Smith is not going to be able to use at trial because of the immunity decision by the Supreme Court. And essentially that is because it was a communication between an official and Donald Trump about Trump exercising his presidential authority to try to intervene in the riot at the Capitol. All right. But toward the end of the brief, there is this absolute bombshell revelation that an official inside the White House, who we do not know, walked into the dining room off the Oval Office and advised Donald Trump that Mike Pence had been moved to a secure location and that his life was in jeopardy. And Donald Trump's response to that was, and I quote, "So what?" That moment, like the hair on my arms is standing up right now. That moment of recognizing that Mike Pence could be murdered inside the U.S. Capitol building and responding to that as the president of the United States as with "so what?" tells us everything we need to know about Donald Trump's mental state on January 6th and how far he was willing to go to overthrow American democracy. And it's horrifying. It's truly horrifying. And the other big takeaway, by the way, from that moment in the brief, and the fact that Jack Smith is saying, I'm not going to use this at trial because it is an official communication that arguably falls within the scope of the president's authority, is that it is profoundly humiliating to the Supreme Court in the context of this immunity decision, because without saying it, what it says is this is what the Supreme Court, the 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court, are allowing Donald Trump to get away with. A complete dereliction of his official duties as the president of the United States, merely because the communication happened inside the dining room of the Oval Office in the form of an official communication with a White House staffer. That in and of itself gives me pause as a lawyer, let alone a lawyer who, briefed things all the way to the Supreme Court. It is stunning that the effect of the Supreme Court's decision on immunity is that evidence like that will never be presented to a jury. All that said, the evidence in the section of the brief about what Jack Smith will present at trial is just as damning. And It goes through the impact of Trump's course of conduct related to the fraudulent electors. One of the other big takeaways about this is that Trump himself directed the fraudulent elector scheme from the Oval Office, had phone calls with officials, checked in with people like Steve Bannon and people who we assume to be like Roger Stone, certainly John Eastman, absolutely Giuliani, Sidney Powell. There are various lists going around this morning of who these witnesses could be. And that in and of itself is kind of irrelevant. All right. And please don't guess, because we'll know eventually who these people are when this case goes to trial. But one of the things that is really key here is that the communications that Trump did engage in, that Jack Smith posits, and this is like a no-brainer for Judge Chutkan, in my opinion, as a litigator. The Jack Smith posits are so far outside the scope of his presidential authority that fell absolutely within the realm of him as a candidate, are just as scathing and resulted in violence and threats and harassment of state officials. There's one section in the brief that talks about a state official who had a conversation with Donald Trump. And when that official refused to do what Donald Trump said, Donald Trump lit that official up on Twitter. And the end result was that protesters, quote unquote, rioters, showed up at that person's residence, one of whom was wearing a gun that was visible when that official was trying to put their sick child to bed. I mean, and Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, as I mentioned, their names are blocked out, but they make an appearance in this brief. It's very clear that Donald Trump knew that the impact of his behavior was going to be threats of violence, and he continued anyway. There is one moment referenced in the brief that has been taken wildly out of context, all right, which I just want to make sure everyone here is clear on, which is that there's a reported conversation about a polling place in Detroit where someone working on Trump's behalf had a conversation with someone on the ground there. I believe it was a GOP party official. And that official reported to the Trump co-conspirator, this sounds like the Brooks Brothers riot. Dating myself here, but those of us who lived through the, Bush v. Gore in 2000 know that there was this event at a polling place in Florida where a bunch of guys in khaki pants and button-down shirts, through the instruction of people like Roger Stone, charged at the polling place, beat on the doors. There's all this footage of this. Stop the count, right? That event has been referred to as the Brooks Brothers riot. So there's a reference point, like speaking of past as prologue and history repeating, where this official in Michigan says to the Trump person, this sounds like it's going to be a Brooks Brothers riot. And the response from the Trump co-conspirator, who very well may be Roger Stone, we don't know for sure, said back was, do it. Make them riot. Okay. So there's no question here that there was at this point an opportunity. I'm going to block this person right now. There was an opportunity there for there to be an understanding that there was likely to be violence emerging from this course of conduct. And the co-conspirators simply did not care. One of the things I'm going to remind you all about conspiracy law, by the way, is that when you have agreed to participate in a conspiracy to a certain end, you do not have to personally have knowledge of other things that are being carried out by co-conspirators in order to be held liable for that criminal conduct. So the fact that a co-conspirator said, do it, make them riot, is attributable to Donald Trump as one of the co-conspirators who assented to the purpose of the conspiracy generally. All right. It is, I really don't really have, I don't have words for this, in like the almost 30 years that I've been a lawyer now, I don't think I've ever read a brief that was as universally damning of a defendant as this brief is. And to be very honest, I don't see any way, assuming that this case, and I do think it will, through Judge Chutkan, be allowed to proceed outside the scope of the Supreme Court's immunity decision. I'm just going to say one other thing. If I was SCOTUS and this appeared before me again, there's no way I'd be granting a second round of certiorari on it. Why? Because it is going to double down on the humiliation of the Supreme Court and the politicization of the Supreme Court, and it's going to make them look really stupid and partisan. So I'm not convinced that this is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court again, just FYI, but I do want people to be truly thoughtful here about the fact that the purpose of this brief, and actually the legal argument in this brief, is so compelling and so strong and so well drafted that it is honestly a no-brainer for Judge Chutkan to allow the case to proceed. Oh, here we go. Got another one. Bye. You're gone. So again, just keep in mind here that we are in a position now where I'm going to get this person also. We're in a position here now where the tenor of this case has been dramatically amplified by this filing. And I want everybody to also understand a couple of other things about the nature of the potential impact of this. All right. So one thing that we need to talk about today is that there is a reference point to multiple phone calls being made to electeds on the Hill during the January 6th riot. And there's an enormous amount of speculation about who these people already are. We already know some of these names from other filings and evidence that's been put before the January 6th committee. We know Rudy Giuliani left messages on Tommy Tuberville's Capitol Hill voicemail, for instance. We know that. Jim Jordan has admitted that he had conversations with Donald Trump on the day of in a very awkward interview where the footage of which will never leave me. The true question here is how many? And what was the nature of those conversations? I'll be very curious to see whether or not we learn that at trial, okay? There's also, at this point, serious questions about Mike Lee's potential involvement, right? Because there seems to be a reference point that Mike Lee may have been one of the people involved in these conversations on January 6th itself. So we don't know what the implications of that are going to be, but I'm going to let somebody else know. Let all of you know about some other things that could happen here to other folks, all right? I have said for a very long time, those of you who are longtime followers here know this, that Jack Smith clearly made a prosecutorial decision here to file the leanest possible case he could in DC for January 6th and the fraudulent elector scheme against Donald Trump only in the hope of getting this case tried before the 2024 election, all right? It does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that there will not be indictments of other people. All right. And one of the things that's very clear here from the designations inside the brief is that there are CC, meaning co-conspirators, unindicted co-conspirators thus far, who have committed crimes, who are co-conspirators of Donald Trump's in furtherance of this entire scheme. And the real question here now for me is whether or not after the 2024 election, we're going to see a series of other indictments drop based on this course of criminal conduct. Okay. So I want people to just understand that this story is so far from over. And we know that certain people, we know who some of these people are. Steve Bannon, we know, has been identified as one of the co-conspirators because there are references to his podcast and things that were said on it. Okay. We know that the lawyers who have been indicted in Fulton County, John Eastman, Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis, various other folks who authored memos and the like are certainly folks who would be expected to be co-conspirators in the fraudulent elector scheme. We know that Donald Trump took advice from Rudy Giuliani. He is certainly a referenced co-conspirator in this scheme. So I do think that we are going to see additional indictments drop here. I have no question about it, actually. I would bet a lot of money on that. The related issue here is whether or not we're going to see the indictment of elected officials. And one of the things that we can't tell from this brief yet is whether or not Jack Smith has evidence of things that elected officials did in furtherance of the fraudulent elector scheme beyond what has been revealed in this brief, of which there is some, okay, small amount, whether or not he has evidence of other things that were done by elected officials in furtherance of the fraudulent elector scheme in January 6th. And given that we know that he was able, for instance, to download and pull cell phone messages, WhatsApp messages, even information that was deleted off of people's cell phones, I would not be surprised one bit if he has additional evidence against elected officials that we don't know about yet. And so I'm waiting at this point until after the 2024 election to see what comes next. But I think we all should truly buckle up, because I would not be surprised one bit to see indictments drop, not just of the co-conspirators, but honestly of some of these elected officials. Somebody asked a question on the Patreon feed. Reminder, if you want to support this broadcast, you can become a paid subscriber over at patreon.com/resistancelive for as little as $5 a month. That's less than 20 cents a broadcast. And you get to ask me questions that I will answer on the air Also, if this is helpful to you right now, please hit the thumbs up on this broadcast and subscribe to this channel. Hit that bell notification. I'm here 5 or 6 days a week with this kind of stuff. So please join us if you have not yet done so already. Subscribing here to the YouTube channel is completely free. I will just let you all know that the Patreon feed was full this morning with questions about how this is likely to impact the election and how this is likely to impact the jury pool. So let's deal with those two issues separately. It's a good question whether or not this brief dropping at this moment is going to have an impact on voter turnout, on independence. You know, you all know my perspective on this. I don't know how anyone could be independent at this point. But one of the things that folks should be considering here is the fact that last night on Fox News, for the first time, a Fox News anchor said, we are learning that Donald Trump resorted to crimes to try to overthrow the 2020 election. Now, I'm going to remind you all, okay? Fox News, News Nation, the far-right ecosphere is a bubble. And the people who are in it and who are getting all their information only from those sources have not heard before yesterday that Donald Trump actually committed crimes, okay? Every other filing in this case, even his conviction of 34 crimes in New York City, was completely downplayed and dismissed on Fox News. So this moment where, even if it has not yet broken through to voters, it has broken through on Fox News that Trump actually engaged in criminal conduct and that they are reporting that to their viewers, stands some chance of having an impact. Now, am I going to tell you that I think it's enormous? You know, these people are in a cult, all right? We talked about this so many times. I'm not sure that it's going to have that much of an impact. Will it have some? Yes. But in terms of people who are quote unquote undecided, don't ask me how, independents who maybe are thinking about voting third party because as a protest vote, right? There is a potential for impact based on what we have seen now, because one of the things that you have to take away from this, whether you're hearing about the details here, you're hearing about them on another news channel, or you've read the brief itself, is that there is a tremendous risk to the future of American democracy in the event that Trump ends up back in the Oval Office. Like, one of the things that that I took away from the brief as well is the way in which all of this would have worked were it not for the somewhat fumbling and unprepared nature of the fraudulent electors scheme and the willingness of state level officials to be a backstop to what Donald Trump was trying to accomplish. All right. And I had a moment yesterday when I was even reading the details in the brief about January 6th itself, where, you know, there's a way in which it almost feels lucky that we escaped from that day with our democracy intact. And so I don't think that there is any moment, you know, going forward where any of us can have any doubt about the fact that American democracy would end if Trump ends up back in the White House. And I hope that that message is getting through to some people who maybe it hasn't reached before. Am I holding my breath on that? No. Am I going to tell everybody here, like I tell you guys every day, mobilize like lives depend on it, because it does. All gas, no brakes between now and November 5th. Get it done. We really don't have a lot of time now. Nonetheless, I do think that there is a possibility that this filing will finally wake some people up. And I'm not going to count on that. It's not going to alter my behavior in relation to my own mobilization work any more than it should alter yours. But I do think that there is an opportunity here to maybe break through in a new way to some folks, okay? And again, you know, this is something else that you all can use in your own mobilizing work, and you should, right? You should. Are you familiar with this new brief that was just filed by Jack Smith? Do you know that it talks about Trump engaging in this insane degree of crimes to try to overturn democracy? Like, we can't let that happen again. We can't let him have any authority like that again. It would be the end of us, right? So, you know, and again, reminder, like, this comes on the heels less than 24 hours later of J.D. Vance refusing to state at the debate that he believed that Trump lost the 2020 election. Like the danger now is perhaps even more extreme than it was before. All right. So stay focused. All right. As for the question of the jury pool, which is a really legitimate question, someone asked on the Patreon feed a very specific thing about this, which is what happens if a potential juror is called to Trump's trial in DC and they're asked if they've read this brief. Well, I'm going to remind you all, those of you who were here when we went through jury selection in the New York City case, know that there is a process called voir dire or voir dire. Some people choose to not do the French pronunciation, where lawyers are allowed to ask potential jurors questions about their potential bias. All right. And there's a certain number of strikes that are given to each side where they can nix a juror for no reason whatsoever. And usually those are used for perceived bias. They're not unlimited. A juror can be struck for cause, which is where they have like a legitimate, like they say they can't be impartial, or they can be struck as in the form of what's called a peremptory challenge that is given to each side. All right. So here, there will be peremptory challenges. There will be an opportunity for Trump's lawyers to be like, we're not taking juror number 7 because we think they can't be impartial for whatever reason. And there's nothing unlawful about that. That's a legitimate way of culling the jury pool that's given to both sides. Okay. Do I think that it's possible that someone could read this brief and still take an oath as a juror that they can be impartial? Sure. I don't think I would be able to do that, frankly, but I'm sure there are people who could. All right. And in that instance, it's very important to remember that every juror is going to be sworn to an oath as a juror that says they agree to be fair and impartial. They agree to rule on Trump's guilt or not guilty nature, depending on the evidence that is presented at trial only. All right. Only. And I think that there is a strong possibility that there are people out there who could do that. So, this is not something that is going to like create an automatic bias in the jury pool. And I'm also just going to say this. I mean, obviously I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years. I can sit down and cull through this brief, fairly quickly. It is 165 pages and do the big takeaways and understand what the implications are for the law, for how this is going to be argued in front of a jury, for how the evidence is likely to be presented at trial. I used to be a trial lawyer. I practiced in this court. That may not be the case for like the average everyday citizen, right? They're going to be interested in the details of the evidence that's going to be presented, but they're not going to be able to go into a court as a juror if they have no legal training and be like, well, this is the thing that proves Donald Trump's mens rea for this particular criminal count and all of the elements that are required to be proven for it. Like they're not going to do that. And also they wouldn't be allowed to do that inside the jury room. Okay. So in other words, don't worry about the jury pool here. There's plenty of backstops and plenty of, ways in which the judicial system in Donald Trump's trial will protect against bias. And I have to say this also, everything that we have seen from Judge Chutkan here is supremely well played. She is an incredible jurist. She has a very solid reputation. She also did something yesterday in the issuance of this brief that a lot of people missed in the noise, which is that she issued an order when she agreed to allow this brief to be filed on the public docket that essentially put a shot across the bow for Donald Trump's legal team. Because what she said was, you made all sorts of arguments in response to why this brief should not be made public that have no basis in law and no evidence to support them. Essentially, they argued it's too close to the election for this to be released, right? After fighting for so many delays, they made these arguments that it was election interference. And she basically said to them, the time for your bullshit is over. She didn't say it in those words, but there's a very stern warning at the end of the order about the fact that going forward, they should confine their arguments to the issues before the court. And that is a way of essentially saying to the attorneys, your moment at this point has come. Like, if you continue to engage in this kind of behavior, you will be sanctioned. And she said that without saying it, but that is absolutely the message that is being put forward at this point from this court toward the attorneys. Okay, I'm going to block you also. Bye. We have lots of trolls today because it's like a very, very, very important broadcast. Okay. All right. So final issue that was raised today relates to the nature of an October surprise. And I want people to be to be mindful, okay, that there are folks out there signaling that there's going to be some kind of October surprise with regard to Kamala Harris. Hillary Clinton said it. Heather Cox Richardson has signaled that it's a possibility. None of these people have any inside information that there's going to be some scandal breaking around Kamala Harris or anything else. And I do have to point out, Hillary Clinton had perhaps the worst October surprise of any presidential candidate in history in the form of what Jim Comey did like 10 days before the election itself on but her emails. All right. And I have to just say this, okay? I can't imagine the trauma that Hillary Clinton is carrying around from what happened in 2016. I imagine that it is, her hikes in the woods and her Chardonnay can only go so far, all right? And I want people to understand that part of what is happening here, I think, in the way that this is being signaled is not that anybody has some bombshell about Kamala Harris that's going to drop, but rather that they want the electorate to be prepared that if something does drop that sounds funny, our obligation should be to not get distracted and to keep getting out the vote. All right. So I don't want anybody to be operating from a place of like paranoia that there's some kind of breaking October surprise related to Kamala Harris that's going to tank this campaign at the last minute. I do not think that is going to happen. All right. And I think they're going to pull out everything they can, which they already are. So much racism, so much sexism, so much misogynoir, so much hate, all this insane stuff about like migrants and blaming everybody, people who have come to this country seeking a better life for every imaginable issue, like school shootings. Like I keep having this moment where I'm like, the next thing that they're going to blame people for is what? They're going to blame, they've already blamed the housing crisis on immigration. I mean, like how insane can you get? All right. It's so much crazy. They're going to throw everything that they can imagine at the wall and hope that it sticks in people who don't know any better. All right. In people who are so stupid that they have fallen already for the con man grifter who's out there trying to sell them $100,000 gold watches made in China, as if that's not like just sheer snake oil nonsense at this point. All right. I mean, you can't look at this brief without knowing that he's a criminal, and it is the ultimate October surprise. Will there be others? Yes. I mean, I think we're in for like an October full of October surprises. Some of them will benefit us. Some of them may not. Okay. But I want people to be very, very clear here. Okay. No matter what comes down the pike in the next 33, 32 days. Okay. Our job is purely to stay focused on getting out the vote for Democrats, for Harris Walls, and for like blue candidates up and down the ticket, including in your most local elections. Why? Because whether or not your vote is going to be counted depends on who you elect locally at the state level. All right. And we need the House back to effect all the democracy protection work, among many other things that we need to put in place in the law so that Trump and his ilk can never rise again. We need a Senate full of filibuster busting senators, people who are willing to exercise the nuclear option to end the filibuster so Roe versus Wade can be codified, so the John Lewis Voting Rights Act can be passed, so that we can prevent somebody who's been convicted of felonies forever running for the presidency. None of that can happen if we don't mobilize to get out the vote. All right. And no matter what happens, do not neglect the end game. All right. Like there's going to be a lot of crazy nonsense coming at us this month. And, again, these revelations should make a difference to some people. All right. But no matter what, the only thing that matters is getting out the vote. And I don't care that Doug Emhoff had an affair. Like, I mean, come on, like, who cares? That is like old news at this point. His ex-wife has come out endorsing him and Kamala and, has said that he's been a great father to their kids and that their partnership as co-parents has been tremendous. I don't know how they make any noise about that. And by the way, the absolute hypocrisy of Donald Trump being convicted 34 times for fraudulent documents related to an affair he had with an adult film actress while Melania Trump was postpartum with Barron. I mean, come on, give me a break. All right. We'll see what else comes down the pike, but like, do not be the dog in up. Okay. We are not the ones who go squirrel when they raise some insane thing and expect that it's going to throw the whole election. We stay focused on getting out the vote. That is like the only thing that matters between now and November 5th. All right. So that's my big roundup of this brief and all the takeaways from it. I want to thank you all for being here today. Reminder, if this is a meaningful broadcast to you, please hit the thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, drop me a comment in the comments because it tells the algorithm that this broadcast matters to you. And don't forget to share it. You can share it with your family, with your friends, with the organizing groups you're involved in. And if it helps you and you've learned something today, I'd really appreciate it if you would consider becoming a paid subscriber over at patreon.com/resistancelive, because that's how we pay my back-end staff. That's how I get compensated for all the work that it takes to create this broadcast 5 or 6 days a week. And you get other perks if you join over at Patreon also, which are fun, like progressive coffee hour every weekend. All right, my friends. Wild wrap up to the week, and we still have tomorrow. It's been a hell of a week already. All right. So I will see you all back here tomorrow at regular time. Thank you all for your commitment to democracy, to getting out the vote, to building a better future for America and everybody in it. And I will catch you all here tomorrow at regular time. All right. Enjoy your day, everybody. Bye.